Hey there, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. On this episode, I am joined by Professor Heather Littlefield from Northeastern University. And this is a little bit of a bittersweet episode because it is going to be the last episode I release as a high school senior. Just kidding. This is not a bittersweet episode. This is an amazing episode. This is the last episode I will release as a high school senior. What? Okay, cool people. We should be excited. I will no longer be, a little twerp attending. I might puke when I say this, but high school. Anyway, so this episode is very exciting for me, but it is even more exciting because of who I'm joined with. Again, I'm joined by Professor Littlefield, who is the director of the linguistics program at Northeastern. She has expertise in language acquisition, syntactic categories, language and culture, and language prestige and power. She also has an impressive 4.3 rating from Rate My Professor, with 100% of reviewers saying they would take her course again. That is not an easy feat, people. And I stalk that website endlessly, so I will tell you, I know this when I say it, that is hard to achieve. I truly had the best time speaking with her. She is an incredibly brilliant person, and so I hope you will learn just as much from her as I did. So please sit back, relax, enjoy this episode, and learn as much as you possibly can. So, welcome, Professor Littlefield. I am so excited that you're here. Could you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your work in linguistics and sociolinguistics and linguistic power and prestige?
Yeah, so my training is in applied linguistics. I have a PhD from BU. And while I was there, I was very interested in language acquisition and especially the acquisition of syntactic categories. So really interested in like how syntax treats categories that aren't clear, like prepositions. And then I moved over to Northeastern, where I've been a full-time teaching professor. And over the years, I think my interests have they shifted or just grown maybe in scope, so that I've become more and more interested in how language plays a role in power and prestige, as you've mentioned. I think that we're very often unaware of the language that we use, and people can be prejudicial or negative toward other people in their language. And then they feel like they have plausible deniability because they say things like, oh, but I'm not a racist, or, oh, I'm not prejudicial because I didn't do anything. But really, perhaps they are in the language that they use. And I think this has become more understood in the general population through the discussion of things like microaggressions. But still, it's something that I'm curious about. I've designed a couple of courses. One actually is called Language and Power. And then, of course, we touch on it in courses like sociolinguistics, language and gender, and so on.
Okay, so what is, in a nutshell, for our listeners, I would say, what is sociolinguistics? What would you talk about in those language and power? Like, what do language and power have to do with each other?
Yeah. Maybe I'll take a quick step back and so I'm not sure if the listeners know what linguistics is.
Sure,
So
go ahead.
just to start at the very basic level, linguistics is the scientific study of language. So we are very interested in patterns of language use cross-linguistically, how that interacts in the brain, how that interacts in society, and so on. So linguistics is very broad. Sociolinguistics is one segment of linguistics. One way you can think about linguistics is you have the core structures that make up a language itself, right? So the sounds, the phonology, the words, and the word parts, so things like morphology, the meanings in words and sentences, so semantics, syntax, which is kind of bringing those words together to make sentences. But just knowing the structure of the language isn't enough to be able to speak a language. You need to know the social rules of how to use the language. So we need to know what we might refer to as the pragmatics and the sociolinguistic rules of the language. So we need to know when to speak softly, when to speak loudly, when we can speak, when we need to be quiet, when we can swear, when we can't swear, what form of swearing we can use, when to accommodate to somebody's dialect, when not to accommodate to somebody's dialect. So all of those elements are going to be parts of sociolinguistics and some of that is pragmatics too. Pragmatics and sociolinguistics tend to go together. But sociolinguistics really is the study of understanding how people use language in context. So it's not just the rules, but how those rules are applied in context.
Okay. And then in those courses that you mentioned, courses like language and power, et cetera, what do you talk about? And what do those two things have to do with each other?
Yeah. So the language and power course and more too, as I designed a course this year for incoming students who were undeclared majors, looking at dialects. And there too, I think one of the big themes is understanding how dialects play a role in the power structures of, say, the United States or language structures around the world. But I think one way of thinking about it is that language can be a gatekeeper. So if you think about how maybe employers look for and hire candidates in an interview or maybe even in a cover letter, if they see dialect markers that they think are less prestigious, they're less likely to hire those people. And so that use of dialect as a marker, right, to stereotypically believe somebody may be dumb or less educated because they have certain dialect markers is pretty prevalent, pretty common. And we also see this in work by John Baugh, who has a huge body of work looking at the fact that if you call about an apartment and you have a non-standard dialect, the person wanting to rent their apartment won't even let you come and see the apartment. They'll just say it's not available anymore, that it's been taken. But if the same person calls, right, who has a standard dialect, the person says, yeah, come on over and see the apartment, right? So it has nothing to do with the person's qualifications. It's how they sound, right? So again, using dialect markers, right? So the linguistic structures of the dialect as an indicator of a person's qualifications, I guess, for a job or for an apartment, those can be seen as a gatekeeper, right? Because people who are in positions of power will use those linguistic markers to sort how they feel about candidates. And again, it's not based on the person's actual qualities or skills. It's based on stereotypes of how we feel about dialect.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So looking at that, a big reason or a big theme for me in doing this podcast was that I wanted to talk about accents and dialects as a social identifier because they're not often considered a social identifier. And so I want to ask, what do you think about that? What do you think about accents and dialects as a social identifier? Should they be considered a social identifier? Because you can, as we know, it's something that you can manipulate and you can change, whereas race, ethnicity, things like that can't just be shifted based on what we want or what we feel.
Yeah. I guess I have a couple of thoughts about that. First, 100% dialect is a social marker.
Yeah.
So one thing I sometimes tell my students is, especially with, so it used to be like clothing was a huge marker of social status, but now with knockoffs, like we can all go down to the local mall and dress, pretty inexpensively as well and look as well as somebody who's, going from a high-end fashion house because of those kinds of knockoffs. So we can all kind of look the part. It's pretty easy to kind of play the part. But as soon as we open our mouths, people will know we don't belong, right? Because we don't have the right word choice or the nuances of the vowels that we use are not correct for whatever social class we're aiming for, right? So and in fact, I can't remember who said it, but there's a nice quote, that maybe linguistics is the last refuge of kind of open prejudice, right? Because, not linguists themselves, obviously, right? But that use of dialect and you're right also that people may be able to shift dialect, but it's not that easy to do, right? So we might be able to take on a few of the words of the other dialect, but it really, for most people, it's pretty hard to shift dialects. Like we're pretty ingrained with where we've come from. And of course, there's a whole lot of literature on how and why people shift dialects too, right? So if we're highly motivated, it's a little bit easier. But most of us, by the time we're adults, we've kind of come to the dialect persona, if you will, that we're comfortable with, that we want to represent us. And it can be really hard to shift that, especially because as non-linguists, we don't hear all those nuances of vowels or the articulation of particular consonants, or we can't do the R deletion as a native speaker might do it in a particular dialect. So, I mean, we can adopt the vocabulary pretty easily, but some of those markers are pretty hard to nail.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's interesting to speak about, because a lot of the people, so I interviewed a lot of teachers from my high school for this, and several of them talked about training themselves out of a previous accent because of social pressures or whatever. But I think it's important to note that it's quite difficult once you've reached a certain age, or even if it's not something you need to do, if it's not a pressing concern. So I've talked a lot about how accents and dialects relate to race and class and intelligence and stuff like that. But I noticed, looking at some of the courses and research you're involved in, you do a lot of research on dialects and gender. So could you talk about how those two things are related and what we should know about accents, dialects, and gender?
Yeah. So I would set accents aside, I guess, just because accent in my mind is kind of the lay person's way of talking about dialect, and it really just means the phonological features. So I guess I would prefer kind of thinking maybe about dialect or sociolect, right? So kind of the full features, right? The bound morphemes, the word choice, the articulation of the vowels and consonants, right? Kind of the whole compilation. Also differences of pragmatic use. So for example, women are expected to swear less than men, women aren't expected to interrupt as much as men, and so on. So kind of bringing that into language and gender, we could be here a long time. I'll try to just give a few tidbits, I guess. Do you have any particular question that you want to hone in on, Talia, or something?
Not really, but I mean, I think I notice that I speak differently than my male friends who are the same age, particularly with vocab. As I just said there, I said particularly. Just little things like that, whether it's personality or not, I don't actually know, but we all know, I mean, that women apologize more, and that's the whole thing. And of course, several years ago, when Elizabeth Holmes was a big name in the news for the whole Theranos scandal, she spoke in that really, really deep, really, really deep. I can't even get that low, but she did that really, really deep voice, because if women speak in lower voices, they're seen as more powerful and intelligent, I guess. So
and there's definitely research. I mean, I remember experiencing this myself as a college student. I was on the debate team. And at the same time, I was also taking voice lessons as a singer. I had aspirations of being an opera singer at one point, but I kept getting sore throats. You were trying to, I guess, subconsciously make myself sound more masculine. So I would lower my pitch, which would then give me sore throats, which then made it harder to pursue voice lessons and things like that. Because of that kind of masculization. And there's research that shows that women do this a lot. There's research, I think it's out of Arizona State University, showing that women in the military, especially as they're aiming for leadership positions, do this a lot and then lose their voices because, we're kind of speaking outside of what our normal range would be in order to obtain that lower range.
So what you're saying there is that it is both beneficial and extremely not beneficial to lower one's voice, or to sort of acquiesce to the social pressures that women feel.
Yeah, I think women, I mean, it goes back for, I don't know when we'd want to start the starting point of this, but because of the social pressures where men, by virtue of being men, have more power than women are having to, I guess, almost overperform to a degree, right? Because we have to be very feminine in feminine context, but then if we're in a masculine, say, professional context, then we have to perform more of a masculine role. And as we saw with the voicing example, it may help us to obtain a higher position, a higher rate of pay, but then there can be physical consequences like losing your voice all the time.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. That was really well put. So I'm curious to know, so we know linguistics and sociolinguistics and dialect prestige, as you call it,
Mm-hmm.
it's not always talked about, at least not in like my everyday life as a high school student in this country. It's not, right? And so should it be talked about more, but also why? Why and what would that look like? What would a world look like if we were more aware of dialect prestige and how dialect affects us every day?
Yeah, I do wish people would talk about it more, a lot more. I think one thing we can do by talking about different dialects and, just taking the United States as a case study, perhaps more languages and language interaction would allow us to better understand both our history and our current social positioning. So if you look at basically all of the dialects that are minority dialects in the United States, the vast majority of them we see in a pejorative light or a negative light. Take Black English as an example, or African American vernacular English. In linguistics, we have a number of ways of talking about this. It's a really interesting and complex history, going back to it, creating as a Creole language, a language of its own, having a unique history, and then over time kind of approaching English, right, decreolizing a bit, but still containing its own unique features. And because of the history of the enslavement of Africans in that language creation history, you have a huge prestige difference between English and Black English. And that social evaluation is retained today. So we still see that there's a higher prestige for, I don't even know if I want to call it standard American English, but kind of higher class English in America versus Black English. But then you have these really interesting patterns that I think people should be aware of and understand. The complexities of language are mirroring the complexities of, real life, I suppose, of those social patterns. Just to give you one example, people in news media, in basically all over education settings and so on, really disparage Black English as a language of laziness, uneducated people. Like, people really don't like it. But if you look at the popularity of things like hip hop, rap music, right, it comes from that heritage of Black English. And what you'll see in the upper class white slang that young people use is they will, I guess words are escaping me right now, but like co-opt Black English slang, and then it's cool. So it's cool when white people take it over, but when African Americans use it, it's not. It's seen as dangerous or derogatory in some way. And I think that just speaks to the overall class and race prejudices, I guess, that we have in the United States. And so, at least in my experience, talking with students who know nothing about linguistics, about dialects, is a way, if you structure it properly, I think, is a way to engage them with the history of these dialects and how that history has had a profound effect on where we are today and our continuing imbalances and prejudices with regard to the language varieties. We can kind of focus on that, but it's a metaphor for what's really happening from people to people, groups of people, and how they see one another.
Thank you. Yeah, that I think that's really important to talk about. I have not touched on that yet, like on this podcast. And I think that's important. I read some sort of essay, I don't know, a couple of years ago by, I'm blanking on her name, but some activist. And she was talking about how the question at the end of the article was something about what if white Americans loved Black people as much as they loved Black culture? And I think that is the important question here, right? Because as you're saying, it's like we co-opt or mimic or kind of steal in some sense, and then it's cool. I
think too, that just sparked a couple of the let's see, Bell Hooks has a great article on the oppressor's language. It's an essay that she has, which is fabulous. And then Vershawn Young also has a great article which is written in Black English and challenges teachers to allow their students to write and read in their own dialect, right? Rather than always moving to the standard. And I think that's a challenge to standard English speakers to engage more with other dialects. It's almost a position of privilege, I guess, that we can go to school and everything's so easy for us because we immediately know the dialect that's being written in. But if you can imagine being, 5 or 6 and coming to school and your native dialect has been Hawaiian Pidgin or Black English or a non-standard dialect, you come to school and you're looking at words and a language structure that's somebody else's language structure. Like you have to go through multiple steps to obtain the ability to read because you're having to already shift from one dialect to another. And the spellings and things may not really represent, how you would say things, and the structures may not represent how you would say things. So one challenge that I try to give my students is to think about, and they're at a major research university, so they're at a really high level, but the catch for me, I think, as a professor, is that I am meant to teach these students how to write in a professional way.
Yep.
But as a linguist, that professional way is in one prestigious dialect, and that they should set aside all of their native dialects. I find that very problematic. And I try to challenge my students to think about, when you're in a hiring position, or if you are writing a paper, might it be more helpful to draft your paper in your own dialect and then rewrite it how the teacher wants it, right? Get your ideas out in your own way, because I think it can be very constraining to just write in this standard dialect that may not be your own. And then I think the challenge for standard dialect speakers is to learn to read and listen to other dialects and accept them. I had this argument with somebody once. It's just like burned into my mind. They were shocked that I ever thought that a student should write in African American vernacular English or should write in Hawaiian Pidgin, and they were like, their big argument was, but I would never understand them. And I'm like, that's kind of your problem. Like, if you read a couple of those papers, you could understand it. And if you didn't understand 100%, you're still going to understand 95%. What do you think their experience is, as they're always having to read standard English? Like, they're always understanding 95, 99% because they get really good at it, right? But it's not their native. Like, why do you think you have the right to understand everybody 100% of the time, but you're making everybody meld themselves to your ideal and not ever meld yourself to what their experience is? That just really, really bothered me. But I think that's probably a pretty common feeling. And actually, I think you see that a lot if you, I put together a unit this term. I actually got COVID, so I was out for about a week, and I put up a couple of, modules where students could work their way through on their own without me. And one was on Latino American English, right? So kind of, some people might call it Spanglish. One thing we talk about in linguistics is mock Spanish, where English speakers who know very little Spanish try to sound like they're speaking Spanish by adding an O suffix to things, right? So we might say like, oh, how are you doing in schoolo or something, or we might add an L determiner or article, right? So El Capo for a cup or something like that, right? And we think we're so clever because we sound Spanish. But if you look on YouTube for something like, rants against Spanish or something like that, there are hundreds and hundreds of videos on YouTube showing American English speakers yelling at people who even speak perfect English but have a slight Spanish accent. These people are fully bilingual in Spanish and English, and yet Americans are saying to them, like, you're not American. Oh, they even say things like, go back to your country. Well, most of them were born here. This is their country. They are American citizens, right? And to have this kind of double standard, right? So an American standard English speaker who's taken like 2 semesters of, high school or elementary school Spanish is like so proud, oh, I can speak Spanish.
Right.
They can't, right?
Right.
And yet we will denigrate and tell people to go home, quote unquote, who are fully bilingual, right? in 2 languages and can switch between the 2. And that hatred that, and of course not, I can't speak with such a broad brush to say it's everybody, but it's very pervasive. We see this as well with something in linguistics we refer to as mock Asian. So people will hear people speaking in an Asian language, maybe Chinese Mandarin or Cantonese, and then American English speakers will try to sound like that, and they'll use phrases like ching chong. And again, there are lots of videos online that show that as well. I don't know where I'm going with this, Talia. Help me. What was the question originally? I think just to say that there's a lot of linguistic prejudice. And if we could, I guess, open that conversation and give students and people in general an insight as to how damaging that can be, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that you said it. Yeah, it's, what is it? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. That's what needs to happen here. And then also bringing back to the other thing you said, it's like if a white person born in the US was then to be bilingual in both Spanish and English, that would be seen as very, very impressive. But if it's sort of the other way around, it's not seen that way.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato. I've been Talia Sherman, and special thanks to Professor Heather Littlefield and Molly Herman for helping her get on this podcast. This is the last episode that I will release as a high school senior, but the podcast will continue on because so long as I'm here, the podcast is going to be here too. Throughout the interview, Professor Littlefield mentioned a lot of research that she's read or heard of, papers published, TED Talks she's watched, etc. And so if you want to get to know the people she mentioned, watch the TED Talks she talked about, read the articles we discussed, please visit the episode description and you'll find links to all those things there. As always, please rate this podcast, review it, subscribe, give me 5 stars, stream me on platforms. I don't know, do your thing. Support me. I'd appreciate it. And I will see you in the next episode. Bye.